It begins with a whisper, a half-buried rumor told in the corner of a small-town bar, passed from one trembling voice to another. They say a girl gave birth, but not just to any child. She gave birth to her own mother's baby, a child that, by every rule of nature, should never have been born. A child whispered about in old court records, erased from family Bibles, and spoken of in hushed tones at graveyards long after midnight. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let me take you somewhere America never wanted you to go. A place not marked on maps, where bloodlines folded in on themselves like a snake devouring its own tail. Where family ties grew so twisted, no one could tell who was the parent, who was the child, or who was both at once. Our story begins in the early 20th century, in the forgotten hills of Appalachia. Isolated mountain towns, cut off from the rest of the world by crumbling roads and steep ridges, lived under their own set of rules. Outsiders rarely came, and when they did, they weren't welcomed. Poverty, secrecy, and pride built walls stronger than stone. But behind those walls, something darker grew. One family, whose name we won't speak here for their surviving relatives, carried with it a shadowed history. The mother, a woman hardened by hardship and silence, gave birth to several children, each one more tightly bound to the family's own bloodline than the last. But it was her daughter who would bring the story to its most horrifying point. By the age of 14, this daughter was already trapped inside a web spun by generations before her. She carried a child that was not only her sibling, but something far more disturbing. That baby, when it arrived, was marked not by innocence, but by the twisted legacy of blood repeating itself. This was not simply a child of incest, it was the child of a child. And when the midwives of the mountains saw what had been born, even they, who had seen everything, turned pale. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. It grew, it spread, and it left scars across an entire community that still linger today. The child that arrived that night was more than flesh and bone. It was a revelation of what had been hidden for generations. The midwives whispered that its features carried both the mother's face and her grandmother's, that its lineage was not a straight line, but a circle collapsing inward. In a town where secrets were currency, this was a secret too heavy to be contained. Families in Appalachia, especially in the early 1900s, lived miles from their nearest neighbors. Schooling was rare, church was the only gathering, and most people never left the hollow they were born into. Poverty forced families to rely on one another in ways outsiders could never understand. But with isolation came consequence, a tightening of the bloodlines. Cousins became spouses, uncles became fathers, and sometimes, mother and daughter became intertwined in ways the human heart was never meant to comprehend. This family, the one at the center of our story, had long been rumored to keep to themselves too much. Few outsiders ever saw the children until they were grown. When they did, they noticed the signs. Eyes set too close together, speech that came slow and slurred, bodies that seemed to carry the weight of ancestry gone wrong. But what happened with the daughter was unlike anything the town had ever faced. She was a child herself, her body still frail, yet she carried her own mother's baby inside her. When the truth became undeniable, some whispered she had been forced, others insisted it was just their way, an arrangement unthinkable to outsiders, but unchallenged behind closed doors. The baby was delivered in silence, the house sealed from curious eyes, the screams muffled by quilts nailed over the windows. When the infant cried for the first time, it was not just the sound of a new life, it was the sound of a bloodline screaming through time, begging to be released from it. Self. No one knew what to call this child. Was it a grandson, a son, a nephew? Or was it, in some dark and twisted sense, a brother? The family buried its truth under layers of denial. They raised the child as if nothing was unusual, though every face that looked upon it knew otherwise. The town chose silence over scandal, but silence only feeds the rot, and soon that rot began to spread. In places like this, silence is survival. The neighbors may have known, the preacher may have suspected, and the whispers may have traveled through every corner of the hollow, but no one dared confront it. To speak aloud what had happened in that house was to brand the entire community with shame. And so they turned their heads, bowed their eyes, and let the secret fester in the shadows. The child grew. At first it looked like any other infant, fragile, needy, searching for warmth, but as the months passed, something unsettled those who saw it. Its features seemed mismatched, as if nature had been forced to stitch together a face from parts that did not belong. The grandmother, now both mother and matriarch, clutched the child with a protective ferocity, daring anyone to question its place in the world. But the girl who had carried it, just a teenager, was never the same again. Her body bore scars that healed, but her mind carried wounds that would never close. Some say she grew silent, barely speaking. Her eyes haunted. Others say she tried to run away, only to be dragged back by the same people who had trapped her to begin with. In a town with no escape, blood ties were shackles, and those shackles cut deep. What outsiders didn't understand was that this wasn't a single event. It was the result of decades of decisions made in darkness. Families, desperate to keep land and legacy within their own hands, refused to let daughters marry strangers from other towns. The walls of isolation became prison bars. By the time the daughter gave birth to her own mother's child, the family tree had already knotted in on itself beyond recognition. But trauma like this never stays locked in one house. It leaks. It stains. The townsfolk, though silent, began to feel it in the marrow of their lives. Children from that family sat in the back of the schoolhouse, mocked and stared at. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their words carried an accent so heavy, even their teachers struggled to understand them. The church pews creaked when the family entered, as if even the wood resisted their weight. And yet still, no one spoke. No one called it by name. They knew if they pulled back the curtain, they would see more than they could bear. So they did what humans always do, with horror too close to home. They pretended it wasn't there. But pretending doesn't erase history. It only makes the reckoning worse when it finally arrives. The years rolled forward, but time did nothing to dilute the strangeness of what had happened. Instead, the weight of the secret pressed harder, warping everyone it touched. The daughter, the girl who had carried her own mother's baby, was forced into a silence that became her identity. She rarely smiled, rarely looked anyone in the eye, as though she carried shame that was not hers to bear, but was stitched into her skin all the same. The child she birthed grew under the grandmother's hand. To the outside world, it was passed off as the youngest sibling, but within the walls of that house, everyone knew the truth. The lines between mother, sister, grandmother and daughter had been obliterated. Language itself no longer had the words to describe what existed there, and when human language runs out, that's when the haunting begins. The child carried marks not just of biology, but of burden. Locals said it rarely spoke, even as it grew older. Its body seemed fragile, as though the act of living demanded too much from it, yet its presence was undeniable, almost spectral, a walking reminder of what the family had done and what the town had allowed. Every time it walked through the one-room schoolhouse door, every time it sat on the edge of the church pew, every time its voice cracked through the stillness of the hills, people remembered. They remembered what had been born in blood and silence, and they turned away. The family was not the only one haunted. The town itself began to carry the curse. Outsiders who moved in rarely stayed long. Crops withered on their soil more often than on others. Fires, small and strange, seemed to lick at the edges of their homesteads. Old women whispered that the land itself had grown tired of swallowing their sins. But still, nothing was spoken aloud, not in public, not where ears could hear. The daughter, who had been both mother and sister, eventually aged, her body worn out far too soon. Some say she withered in her 20s, her health collapsing under the strain of what she had endured. Others insist she lost her mind, retreating into a place where no one could reach her. Whether she lived long or burned out quickly, the truth remains. She was erased. Erased by silence, by shame, and by a family who would rather bury her story than face what it revealed. And yet, the child remained. Proof that the secret was real, that the whispers had weight, that the bloodline itself had bent into something monstrous. By the time the child reached its teenage years, it had become the embodiment of everything the town feared but would not confront. Teachers described its eyes as vacant, its speech as broken, and its mannerisms as strange enough to unsettle even the most hardened mountain folk. To the family, this was just how God made him. To the neighbors, it was the proof of what happens when the bloodline folds in on itself too many times. The truth was more complex. This wasn't simply a child of inbreeding, it was a child born of a generational cycle that no one had dared to stop. His very existence was a scar across the family tree, one that could never be healed because it was carved too deep. Every time he walked through the town square, people looked away. They didn't want to see their own complicity staring back at them. And yet, despite his brokenness, or perhaps because of it, the child was unforgettable. His voice carried like a ghost in the wind, his laughter brittle and unnatural, his movements jerky and fragile. In the stillness of the Appalachian nights, when sound travels farther than it should, neighbors swore they heard him crying long after midnight, a sound that froze even the most calloused hearts. Some said he knew what he was, that he felt it in his bones, that he was both son and brother, both grandson and child. By then the family was fractured. Some members had fled the mountains altogether, desperate to outrun the shame. Others doubled down, clinging to secrecy with a fanatic devotion. The grandmother, the matriarch at the center of it all, kept a watchful eye, her grip on the family as strong as ever. To question her was to risk being cut off, exiled, erased, and in these towns, exile was worse than death. Still, the story spread. Outsiders began to catch whispers. Old records hinted at irregularities, and one or two journalists passed through, only two, leave with notebooks half empty and eyes wide with dread. What they had stumbled across was too disturbing, too strange, too dangerous to put into print. So the truth remained locked in the valley, carried forward only by rumor, until rumor hardened into legend. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run, or would you have stayed and lived with the secret? Because the child didn't get a choice, and neither did the town. As the decades passed, the story began to rot beneath the soil, just like the people who carried it. The child, America's most inbred, the one born from a mother and grandmother at once, did not live to see old age. Whether from sickness, frailty, or the slow erosion of a body built on broken blood, no one can say for sure. What is known is that when death finally came, it was met not with mourning, but with relief. There was no proper obituary, no carved stone in the churchyard. The family buried the child quietly, away from watchful eyes, as if by placing him in an unmarked grave they could erase what he represented. But graves don't keep secrets, and the earth remembers what humans try to forget. The girl who had carried him, the daughter turned mother, the sister turned vessel, was never spoken of again. Her name was scrubbed from family Bibles, her photograph hidden or burned. To outsiders, it was as though she had never lived at all. But the blood she carried, the burden she bore, still pulsed through the veins of those who came after. And that's where the haunting becomes impossible to ignore. Even now, generations later, descendants of that same family walk among us, some never knowing, some hearing fragments of the truth in late-night drunken confessions from old relatives. They carry the shame of something that happened long before they were born, a legacy they did not choose but cannot escape. In the towns nearby, older folks still whisper, They say you can trace the silence back through the years, like rings in a tree. They'll point to a collapsing cabin, its windows boarded, and say, "That's where it happened." They'll nod toward the hillside cemetery, where a patch of earth seems always unsettled, as though the ground refuses to stay closed. But perhaps the most chilling part isn't what's remembered, it's what's been deliberately erased. Court records, missing pages, church logs with entire families struck out, stories told halfway, then cut short with a long, uneasy pause. The truth was never meant to survive. And yet, here it is, resurfacing like a bone pushed up from the dirt by the weight of time itself. This is the danger of silence. Secrets buried in one generation will claw their way out in the next, and when they do, they don't just tell you who your ancestors were, they tell you what you've inherited. When people today hear whispers of America's most inbred child, they imagine it as folklore, an exaggeration, something that could never truly happen. But the story you've just heard isn't legend, it's history. Hidden, yes. Distorted by shame, yes. But real enough that the descendants of this bloodline still walk the earth. Some of them may never know the truth about where they come from. Others might feel it without ever hearing it, carrying the weight of silence in their bones. That is the haunting reality of generational secrets. They echo. They echo in the slurred voices of children born into the same cycle. They echo in the abandoned houses left to rot in the hollows of Appalachia. They echo in the way whole towns fall silent when certain names are spoken. It isn't just one family's burden, it's a reflection of how communities choose denial over confrontation, silence over truth. The daughter who carried her mother's child never escaped her fate. The grandmother who orchestrated it all died with her secret intact, never punished, never questioned. And the child who should never have existed, who lived only a short life, became something larger than himself. He became a symbol of what happens when shame becomes stronger than justice, when isolation feeds on itself, and when humanity chooses to look away. And perhaps that's the part of the story that should unsettle us most. Because this isn't just Appalachia's story, it's America's story. A nation built on buried truths, on unspoken histories, on entire chapters scrubbed from record, for every grave without a stone, for every photograph burned, for every family Bible with names scratched out. There is a story like this one, waiting, festering, refusing to die. If you've made it this far, you now carry this story too. You've opened a door most people would rather keep closed. You've looked at a truth America tried to bury, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So the next time you walk past a graveyard or see a farmhouse sinking into the soil, ask yourself, what secrets were buried there? Whose story was erased? And what will it mean for those of us still living, still carrying the weight of bloodlines we barely understand? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you think about this story. Does silence protect families, or does it destroy them in the end? Because the past never stays buried, and sometimes the blood itself remembers.